The topic that I wanted to talk about is really the role of IAM in the age of network perimeter obsolescence. So when I say network perimeter obsolescence, I'm not saying you should go and throw away your firewall or your VPN devices and not have to worry about that anymore. Obviously, when we talk about security from a defense in depth perspective, these are all very important aspects. But the point is that we can no longer rely on perimeter-based security to secure our environments. It's just not enough anymore. We have mobile devices, cloud applications, your data is everywhere in most cases. And so, really with the increasing amount of identity-based attacks that we're seeing, you have to start with the identity. So identity being the center of security. Really this is the idea that your identity is a sort of a modern control plane or a modern perimeter. So if we could secure that identity, we're gonna stop and squash a very large number of cyber attacks before they happen. So I've broken this talk into 3 different topics. The first is going to be secure authentication. So this is around, things like multi-factor authentication, biometrics, and things that are going to provide a more secure means of authentication. Brian alluded to the identity and access management of when you came here and you told them who you are and they gave you a little piece of paper you write your name on. Not super secure way of authenticating, is it? Fortunately, there are other ways of authenticating that are much more secure in the identity and access management space. When we talk about your data and your applications and things like this, there are much better ways of securing those. The next thing I want to talk about, I keep accidentally hitting that button. The next thing I'm going to talk about is zero trust. And this is the idea of never trusting and always verifying in order to access resources. And this really comes from the assume breach mentality, right? If we assume breach and we prepare for attacks to happen, then we're going to be in a better position to repel and to mitigate those attacks. And the last thing I want to talk about is risk-based identity protection. So this is the idea of leveraging a lot of different telemetry and signals and things like this in order to essentially assign a risk score to our authentications and our accesses. While I do work for Microsoft, I've approached this talk in as much as possible, a bit of a vendor neutral way. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different concepts that apply to identity and access management. And it doesn't really matter whether you're going to Microsoft for those capabilities or whether you're going to another vendor or whether you're doing something else. A lot of these topics are equally as important regardless. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer out. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is secure authentication. So passwords suck. That's really the Reader's Digest version of this slide. Verizon every year publishes a data breach investigation report. In that report, they frequently find that phishing and stolen credential-based attacks are the most frequent, the biggest source of, or the largest threat vectors, if you will. So, on the screen, you see frequently, the Hall of Fame of terrible passwords. And really, the only people that like passwords are attackers, are the bad guys. Even NIST in their special publication 863, they have even said that, hey, maybe we're a little bit wrong when we said that you should have, super long, super complex, super, frequently changed passwords. And they've actually come back and said, well, hey, because we're talking about humans here and humans are the ones that have to make their passwords, that might not be the best approach to security. When we talk about passwords, of course, are expensive and they're not secure, right? So 73% of passwords are duplicates. I'm sure probably everybody in this room at some point or another in their life has used the same password for multiple accounts. I know I certainly have, not now, not recently, but before I got into cybersecurity, that's something I was guilty of. And passwords are the weak link. So as I mentioned, the majority of attacks are because of credentials that have been stolen. Data breaches are expensive. I think that's no surprise to anybody. And also, if you've ever worked in a help desk in your life, you probably are aware that the majority of calls are really related to passwords and people that forget them and having to reset them and those types of things. So what can we do about this? Well, your password doesn't matter. Multi-factor authentication, that's what matters. And there's a number of different ways we can approach MFA, some being more secure than others. But if I could make one point through this whole talk, it's that we need to implement multi-factor authentication. Even Microsoft being one of the largest enterprise identity stores in the world, we still have a very large percent of administrators that have not enabled multi-factor authentication, even though it's free. It's already there. All they got to do is turn it on. And the fact that that's still something we have to keep telling customers can be increasingly frustrating. So there's a number of different very secure ways of providing multi-factor authentication. So Windows Hello is just an example. You may have seen when I opened my laptop that the screen just looked at my face and logged me right in. Very painless. Based on a FIDO2 security standards, it's non-phishable unless somebody manages to cut off my head, and I hope that doesn't happen. FIDO2 security keys are also another means of secure authentication that are, equally as secure. So, using a little device like this, I plug it into my computer, I maybe put in a PIN number, and then I authenticate with my fingerprint, and I'm logged right in. I never have to enter my password. Using an authenticator app like the Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator is also a great way of providing a secure means of authentication. You could do things like have push notifications or have a rolling one-time passcode. And then speaking of one-time passcodes, oath tokens are also another way. I mean, they may be a little bit less convenient, but those are the little tokens you might have on your keychain with the rolling time-based one-time passcodes. And then finally, SMS. And you may be surprised that I'm saying SMS. You might be thinking that's not very secure. And in a way, you're right. There's a talk that a couple security engineers and Google alum did for Stripe, which is a online financial services. They do payments and things like that. And they gave this talk at Stripe sessions talking about how data contradicts so-called best security practices. And one of the first things that they mentioned was that SMS-based multi-factor authentication is better than no multi-factor authentication at all. And that is absolutely true. So it's very expensive to try and mitigate SMS multi-factor authentication. So if that's the only thing you can do to put in front of or to add an extra security layer, then that's what you should do. But ideally, there are some great, much better ways of providing multi-factor authentication that you see up there. Through Microsoft's own internal research, through our security research team, we found that multi-factor authentication is going to mitigate 99.9% of identity-based attacks, which is a huge number. So if you could take one thing from this talk, it's enable MFA. The FIDO2 standards. So talking about FIDO2, when we were talking about things like Windows Hello or those FIDO2 security key devices that I plug into my laptop, is a very awesome way of providing strong authentication. It's not phishable. It's very user-friendly. It respects your privacy. And it uses open and known protocols like WebAuthn and CTAP2. So these are Microsoft's sort of password replacement offerings. As I mentioned, whatever vendor you're using will likely have some other means of approaching passwordless or getting you started on your passwordless journey. And I'd recommend you take a look at that. If you're using a Windows 10 device, Windows Hello is built in. You could probably leverage Windows Hello for Business. And if you are using Microsoft services, then the Authenticator app is another great way of providing secure authentication. And then finally, FIDO2 security keys are also another fantastic way of authenticating. So the next topic I want to talk on, probably the bulk of this, I'm going to have to go really fast because I only have a few minutes, but zero trust. So in the 90s, you'd go to work, you'd reach under your desk, you'd turn this beast on. That was hardwired into your network. You'd go make a cup of coffee, and then when you come back, you'd probably log in and do your work. And that was good. By 1995, a lot of security discussions were around firewalls and IDS and IPS and VPNs, and moving a VPN to the internet, replacing WANs. So that was the security conversation. We did a good job back then, but times have changed. So in 2000, we saw the advent of SaaS applications with Salesforce. A lot of places that you go to right now have public Wi-Fi since 2002. In 2007, we saw the iPhone and Android devices come out, so now everybody has a computer in their pocket that can send somebody to the moon. In 2009, we saw wearables. And then, of course, in 2011, we saw Office 365 based on the old BPOS that came out. So, now we're seeing that SaaS applications and mobile devices, this is ubiquitous just in business for sure. And so your architecture is going to look a lot more like this, right? You have devices all over the place. You have apps and data and things everywhere. And again, having that identity to secure it at the center of it all is hugely important. So why are we talking about zero trust? Assets, the idea is that we want to move our assets away from attackers. So security is complex. Complexity is the enemy of security. The old way of doing things was to have that trusted network security strategy. This was simple and economical, and it did the job. And basically, we'd accept a lower risk within the internal network than we would from those coming outside, because that didn't really happen very much. Attackers have since shifted their way they do things to identity-based attacks. Phishing, credential theft, even just buying a dump or a paste bin full of credentials from someone on the dark web is now becoming an increasingly more frequent thing that we're seeing. And at the same time as that's happening, a lot of businesses are having assets move away from the network, right? So you have mobile devices, people are doing BYOD, you have SaaS applications, so your data's in the cloud, you have all these different ways that people are being more productive and hence opening more threat vectors, and we need to address the security of that. So when we talk about zero trust, where did it start? So 2004, a group of security professionals started the Jericho Forum, and this was all about defining and talking about deperimeterization. Say that 10 times fast. 2009, Operation Aurora attack happened. So that was when a nation-based attack on a bunch of private sector companies that had ties to security and defense contractors or what have you. That was done by one of the advanced persistent threats, or a bunch of advanced persistent threats out of China, including the Elderwood Group and APT1. And essentially what they did was they found their way into those networks, and then all bets were off. They laterally moved around the network and did all sorts of damage, which is no good. In 2010, Forrester introduced the term zero trust. The analyst that created that is now a CTO of Palo Alto, but that's pretty much when the term zero trust started. And then in 2014, Google published the Beyond Corp research paper, which even to this day is pretty awesome. That's when the zero trust topic really took off. And they were basically saying that we need to treat every network as it's an untrusted network. So zero trust is really an approach to security, which again treats all those access attempts as if they're coming from an untrusted network. A couple things that zero trust isn't. So it's not literal. When we say never trust, always verify, we're not saying that we're going to put a retinal scan in front of everything and absolutely make sure 1,000% that folks are who they say they are. What we do is we look at a number of different factors, and we can get to a level of trust that puts the risk at an acceptable level. It's not an adjective. You're not going to become zero trust. It's not for sale. As much as Microsoft and other vendors can sell tools that can help you get there, it's not something you can just go out and buy zero trust. It's not instant, and it's not a revolution. You can build on what you have. So zero trust is a mindset. So one of the biggest benefits is that change in mindset. And I'll talk a little bit about what kind of changes in mindset really come with the idea of zero trust. So the first mindset is everything is on the open internet. This may not actually be literally the case. However, if that's how we're thinking, then we're going to approach security in a different way. Trust no single source, right? So when satellites are trying to triangulate somebody's position, your GPS tells you where your car is, they're bouncing signal back and forth through each other. And that's kind of what we have to do with zero trust. If I look at an authentication request and I say, you're coming from a device that I know that's compliant and secure, and you're coming from a location that I know, and you've authenticated by trusted means, then I'm going to give you access, right? So we're verifying a whole bunch of different things. And breach containment, right? So James Comey once said that there's two kinds of organizations, those who have been breached and those who don't know they've been breached. This picture, I don't know if you've seen HBO's Chernobyl, but on the left-hand side, you have a picture referencing that incident. Where basically after a breach occurred, they said, no, there's no breach. I don't know what you're talking about. Around the same time was an incident on 3 Mile Island in the U.S., and they approached that breach in a very different way, and that's why you don't see shows on HBO about that incident as much. And then the last mindset is there are not enough humans, right? So there's a huge cybersecurity skills gap that we need to address, and through things like automation and the intelligent tools that are being created, we can do this. So with zero trust approach is certainly going to help in that. When Microsoft's approach is zero trust, we do this through something called conditional access and identity protection. So what we do is we evaluate a whole bunch of different conditions, and then based on those, we're also going to run that through our risk engine. So that's going to evaluate the risk, and it's going to process like 171 terabytes of different signals to determine what type of policy we're going to put in place. Are we going to allow that authentication, or are we going to maybe put a multi-factor authentication prompt in front of it? Are we going to get the user to change their password because those credentials have been compromised? Things like that. This brings us to really the last topic of this talk that I want to talk about, which is risk-based identity protection. So this is the idea of leveraging telemetry from a security vendor in order to provide more intelligence to protecting your credentials. So if you think about the kinds of risks that are out there, the kind of attacks that are happening every single day, you could see some pretty staggering numbers on this slide. And companies like Microsoft are and not just Microsoft, but other companies, we're ingesting a lot of telemetry, and we now have the capability with cloud computing, with big data and machine learning and analytics and things like this. We have the ability to do something about it. So as I mentioned before, 81% of breaches are involving weak, default, or stolen credentials. And again, 300% increase in identity attacks just since 2017 alone. So the attackers are getting smarter. We're seeing attacks like password sprays, breach replays, where you're taking the same credentials that were used in one place and using them somewhere else. We're seeing a lot of this stuff. Attackers are getting more sophisticated, so we need to get smarter in the way that we're implementing our security tools as well. And for once, we actually have the capability to get ahead of those attackers. So through connected intelligence, through observing millions and billions and trillions of different signals that your security vendor is going to get from varying places. In Microsoft case, we index web pages, we scan emails for malware, we scan devices, and we're able to aggregate that all into what we call the intelligent security graph. But many other security vendors can do similar things here as well. So being able to take that information, apply continuous detection, and then put in place some sort of automatic remediation. So in Microsoft's case, being the world's largest enterprise identity store, you could see just some examples of some of the data that we're processing that we're integrating into that security graph. And then we're then able to protect our customers by leveraging some of this, right? So, in addition to, scanning emails, devices, and web pages, we also have botnet data from our digital crimes unit. We have our Cyber Defense Operations Center. We have partnerships with other vendors and researchers and law enforcement. So there's a lot of data there for us to leverage. With this capability, we can look at some of these things like users with leaked credentials, sign-ins from anonymous IP address to people that are coming in over the Tor network, impossible travel, sign-in from infected devices or devices part of a botnet, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of different threats that we can detect here. This allows us to monitor that use, create policies as to what's going to happen when we see that happen, right? That conditional access that's going to say, hey, your credentials are leaked. We need you to securely authenticate with a multi-factor authentication prompt and then reset your password. So, again, this is a Microsoft-specific piece, but this is essentially what we do, right? So it's proactive behavior, or proactive protection rather. Giving you actionable insights and automatic remediation based on the type of threats that we see. So I have a number of additional resources here. If you're going to take a picture, I suggest taking a picture of this slide. The first is the SANS webcast. They're doing a secure architecture course. This particular one is basically why perimeter security is obsolete as your means of securing your organization. The Stripe session that I referenced, where data contradicts security best practices, is a great video as well. The Beyond Corp document from Google's there, Verizon breach investigation report. There's a number of different Microsoft resources there. Highly recommend taking a look at those, especially the MFA one, and some great blog posts if you want to do some additional reading on Zero Trust. With that said, I always like to end with a little bit of a laugh. So there's some stuff for you to laugh at. And I thank you very much. So if there's any questions, I can take those now.